Good evening. My name is Karen Engel, and I'm a professor at the University of Texas School of Law and co-direct the Bernard and Audrey Rappaport Center for Human Rights and Justice. On behalf of the Rappaport Center and the Rothko Chapel, and with gratitude to the South Asia Institute, it's my great honor to welcome you this evening to the 7th Annual Francis Tarleton Sissy Farenthold Endowed Lecture in Peace, Social Justice, and Human Rights. I want to begin by recognizing that we're meeting tonight on the indigenous lands of Turtle Island, the ancestral name for what is now called North America. I'd like to acknowledge the Alabama Coshada, Caddo, Carrizo, Comacrudo, Coahuiltecan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan Apache, Tonkawa, Isleta del Sur Pueblo, and other American Indian and indigenous peoples and communities who have been or have become a part of the lands now known as Texas. The event this evening will feature one of the greatest writers, activists, and critics of our day, Arundhati Roy. And although she needs no introduction, she will receive one shortly. It is an honor to share the stage, not only with her this evening, but with my colleague Raj Patel, who will be in conversation with her. I want to begin. This is a happy crowd. And thank you all for your patience as we got everyone in here. I want to begin this program by remembering the person who is really responsible for us being here tonight, Sissy Farenthold. This is the first lecture for which Sissy has not physically been with us, having passed away last September. We're fortunate that her son, George Farenthold, and his wife, Lisa Ryerson, are here. As are two of Sissy's grandchildren. All have flown in from the East Coast, and many of her friends have joined us today from across the country, and even a couple came across a pond. In 2 days, on Earth Day, we will celebrate Sissy's life at 3 p.m. at the law school. If you knew Sissy and would like to attend, we welcome you. Sissy had long been central to both the Rappaport Center and the Rothko Chapel, and she always played a consultative role in choosing our speaker for this series. This year was no exception, as we selected Arundhati Roy well over a year ago. And Sissy greatly admired Arundhati's work and had very much looked forward to being with us tonight. Now, if you know of Sissy Farenthold, you might know that she's a graduate of the University of Texas School of Law, and that as a Texas legislator representing South Texas in the late 1960s and early 70s, she was an outspoken opponent of corruption in her own Democratic Party, the only party in Texas at the time, if you can imagine. You might have heard about how she became a national household name as she galvanized young and progressive people in her race to become Texas governor in 1972, and how, when she nearly missed that, she came in second to be McGovern's vice presidential running mate. Or you might know that she went on to serve as the first chair of the National Women's Political Caucus and become president of Wells College. Above all, though, I want you to know, if you don't already, that Sissy was a grassroots activist who never shied away from speaking truth to power and who shared many of Arundhati Roy's passions. She was long involved in anti-militarist, anti-racist, anti-poverty, feminist, pro-environment, and pro-labor work. A staunch opponent of nuclear weapons, Sissy visited a number of women's peace camps in the 1980s and was co-organizer of the Women's Peace Tent at the UN World Conference on Women in Nairobi. She highly regarded Arundhati Roy's 1998 essay, The End of Imagination, with its trenchant critique of nuclear proliferation, which was so badly needed then and continues to be needed. This endowed lecture is the result of a collaboration between the Rothko Chapel and the Rappaport Center. And we present the lecture in alternating years at each of our locations with the aim of ensuring continued engagement with Sissy's ideas. We're grateful to the many friends of Sissy who have donated generously to make the Endowed series possible, and their names are on the back of the program. Here's our criteria for the lectureship. In line with the mission of both institutions and with Sissy's own history of exposing and responding to injustices and inequality, as both a public servant and global citizen, the lecture series brings internationally renowned scholars and activists who will inspire their audiences to think and act creatively to respond to some of the greatest challenges of the 21st century. It is a demanding call, but it is one that Arundhati Roy has long lived on a daily basis. And we're privileged to have her here to inspire us today. So I cannot possibly name all the people who have made this event happen, but let me try quickly. In addition to David Leslie, Ashley Clemmer, and Kelly Johnson at the Rothko Chapel, and Professor Sharmila Rudrappa of the South Asia Institute, I want to thank Professor Jamie Galbraith for the support of the Lloyd M. Benson Jr. Chair in Government and Business Relations. The Rappaport Center staff and students have been extraordinary in putting together not only our largest event ever, but our first major event since COVID. I want especially to thank Jacob Bloss, who has kept all the balls in the air with astounding grace, as well as Sabrina Barton, Nina Ebner, Ganesh Ibrahim, and our fabulous student team that greeted you at the door. Rachel Lichtig with the LBJ Auditorium and Christina Muhammad of 10,000 Fearless First Responders have worked with us in multiple ways to make sure the event goes smoothly tonight. So it is now my pleasure to invite David Leslie, Executive Director of the Rothko Chapel and our partner in this endeavor, to say a few words from the Rothko Chapel's perspective. And after he speaks, my colleague and co-director, Professor Neville Hode from the English Department, will introduce Arundhati Roy.
Thank you, Karen. When the Rothko Chapel and Barnett Newman's Broken Obelisk were dedicated in Houston, Texas on February 26 through 28, 1971, central to its genesis was the commitment to be a place that would engage life's deepest questions and important societal issues. It was and continues to be a sacred space, an art chapel, open to people of all faiths and those with none. In addition to being a place for meditation and care of the spirit, the Rothko Chapel was envisioned to be both an institution and a movement that would diligently work to further social justice both here in the United States and beyond, focused on a double vocation, one of hospitality and the other of denouncing all forms of imperialism, whether political, economic, social, or intellectual. Thus, it should be no surprise at all that the chapel captured Sissy Farenthal's imagination and drew her into a decades-long service, a legacy of service in support of the chapel's mission, congruent with her commitment to do whatever was necessary to effectively expose and respond to injustice and inequality wherever they were found. She also knew well that every human rights violation not only damages the body, but tears the soul of both individual and community alike. As such, and central to the Farenthal lecture, is the commitment to make sure that we lift up our own and our neighbors' humanity and worth, and be ready to challenge and push back on those powers and principalities that work to convolute, deny, and destroy the essence of life as most fully understood. Now, all this leads to this year's Farenthal lecture, Fascism, Fiction, and Freedom in the Time of the Virus, that will be presented by Arundhati Roy. Elaborating on Karen's insightful introduction, Ms. Roy is not only a storyteller, but a prophet, calling attention to the realities of the day and their implications for tomorrow. Whether we want to hear her words or not. Her commitment to truth-telling comes with cost, but thankfully her voice will not be silenced, for her observations illuminate and bring into the light the inhuman and unjust conditions that so many people face, as well as those who benefit from such inequities. Ms. Roy, we thank you so much for being with us here this evening, and please be confident that your voice is needed more than ever, for you also make clear that there is hope. That hope is only there, though, if we walk and live fully into the call for true equity, justice, and self-determination for all. Your work, indeed, is truly an antidote to the virus of despondency. Thank you.
Thank you.
I also want to add my thanks to what has become a great friendship and colleagueship with Karen Engel and Neville Holt in particular, for their leadership, and again for the work that everyone does at the Bernard and Audrey Rappaport Center for Human Rights and Justice. We need to give them a big shout out, a big round of applause. I also have my thanks to my colleagues that Karen lifted up, Ashley and Kelly Johnson. And finally, while she's not here physically with us, I want to say thanks to Sissy, whose spirit I feel so much is in this room tonight. Sissy, thanks again for allowing us to honor you with this lecture, and for all you did and continue to do through each of us to promote justice and human rights throughout the world. This fall, we will have the lecture back at the chapel. We're kind of a little off schedule because of COVID, so I hope you all will come. And now I want to turn the program over to Professor Neville Holt. Thank you.
Oh, wow, there are a lot of you. It's a little overwhelming to be speaking in public to, I don't know, nearly 1,000 people after a long, long time. Thank you very much, David. I have a quick bit of housekeeping. There are marvelous books for sale. I think you walked past them on your way in here. There will be a book signing afterwards. It will be in this auditorium. So if you want to buy a book and ask Arundhati Roy to sign it, can you walk down this aisle, which is my right, which I think is your left, no, my left, which is your right. This is why I'm sometimes a political liability. And then walk up, get your book signed, and then leave on the other aisle. So that's the one little bit of housekeeping I have for you. All right, I'm just going to get started. You have a short biography of Arundhati Roy in your program, with a selected list of her writings and awards. I urge you to read it, and so I'm not going to repeat any of the very good information that's in there. And you're also going to hear Arundhati Roy read. But I cannot resist giving you a small sample of Roy's powerful and vital prose myself, and show you some of what I think is most remarkable about her inimitable voice, a voice which is utterly lucid, incendiary, and strangely tender. Okay, so here goes. Early on in The God of Small Things, 1997, Esther walks. And Arundhati, I apologize to you because I've actually edited brutally in the interest of time. Some days he walked along the banks of the river that smelled of shit and pesticides bought with World Bank loans. Most of the fish had died. The ones that survived suffered from fin rot and had broken out in boils. Other days he walked down the road, past the new, freshly baked, iced Gulf money houses built by nurses, masons, wirebenders, and bank clerks who worked hard and unhappily in faraway places. He walked past the ration shop that sold rice, sugar, and bananas that hung in yellow bunches from the room. Cheap soft porn magazines about fictitious South Indian sex fiends were clipped with clothes pegs to ropes that hung from the ceiling. Sometimes he walked past Lucky Press, old comrade K.N.M. Pillay's printing press, where midnight studies were held, and pamphlets of rousing lyrics of Marxist Party songs were printed and distributed. The flag that fluttered on the roof had grown limp and old. The red had bled away. End quote. What is most extraordinary to me about this extraordinary passage is the sensuous apprehension of the political and historical world by a narrative voice that makes us see what the character may see, but he may be too traumatized to register. And then, in less than half a page, Arundhati Roy condenses the information of 100 economic, political, historical, and sociological treatises. And more importantly, readers get to see, smell, and feel huge abstractions. The global economy, uneven development, environmental catastrophe, failed political utopianism, commercialized sexual desire, inter alia, simply by having a character walk. We as readers are totally put in that scene, but the specificities of that place are deeply impacted by the wider world. Just as this passage allows us to see the global in the local and vice versa, it also allows wonder and beauty to touch horror as we witness the redemptive power of the imagination and its failures. The God of Small Things and its success provided the platform for an enormous body of work. In a career spanning now close to 30 years, and some 20 plus books, and countless essays on some of the most pressing economic and political questions of our time, Arundhati Roy has shown us that she is one of those rare thinkers and writers of both fiction and social analysis who could truly hear, see, and touch the footsteps of unfolding history, and can amplify those footsteps through incandescent prose with such searing moral clarity that we all can hear them. She has the courage to hear and name the iron footsteps of rising ethno-nationalism, the fascisms that are moving from creep to gallop, increasing inequality between people, nuclear proliferation, development that destroys the many and the earth that sustains us all for the profit of a few. But she also has the ear and voice to render the footfalls of quotidian optimism, the small acts of defiance, and the emergent social movements that show us that another world may be possible. Actually, it needs to be possible. I can think of no one alive today, and I'm sorry to put this kind of pressure on you. I can think of no one alive today better equipped to speak to us about fascism, fiction, and freedom in the time of the virus. Our own Raj Patel, research professor in the LBJ School of Public Affairs, award-winning author, filmmaker, and public intellectual, and himself a powerful voice in the face of injustice, will be her interlocutor. Please join me in giving a warm Texas welcome to Arundhati Roy.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, can you hear me? Excellent. So I hate to do this. You know, we've waited half an hour and Arundhati hasn't said a single thing. I just need to make one final introduction, which is you to Arundhati. My name's Raj Patel. I'm here at the Lyndon Baines Johnson School of Public Affairs. And we're here to have a dialogue that is respectful and wide-ranging. And we have a protocol here at the university about how disruptive activities that prevent the speaker's message from being heard are in violation of the university's institutional rules and are not permitted. But I don't want to go there because instead what I would prefer is for us to, to not contribute yet further to the sort of atmosphere of discord and disrespect that we find ourselves in. So we've got a format today that embraces the many voices that are in this room. Now, acknowledging that many of you have questions, you'll notice in your programs there's a little white sheet of paper. If you would care to write your question or observation or statement or whatever it is that you want to share on that paper in your finest hand and pass it to the side, there are people who will be walking up and down the aisles to collect your thoughts. They will be passed up here, and I will try and do as many of them justice as I can. I'll try and ventriloquize them. I'll make them sound as British as possible. And sometimes, obviously, that's not good. But I'll try and combine as many questions as I can so that Arundhati is able to respond to the dialogue that we very much need to have. But we need to hear Arundhati's voice. And while we'd initially imagined this as a bit of a conversation, Arundhati has written something new for us, especially for this lecture. And Arundhati, I wonder whether you might be able to kick us off with
Yes.
your thoughts this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I have to say that it's rare for me to have arrived in a town and felt so welcome and so loved as I did yesterday. I feel like I never need to leave. So thank you for that. So I wrote this because, things are unfolding at such a pace in India, and it's been a long time since I have obviously spoken to a large audience because of COVID, and I thought that it's best to order one's thoughts in the doing what one does, which is to write. So here we go. Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to deliver the Sissy Farenthold lecture. Before I begin, I'd like to say a few words about the war in Ukraine. I unequivocally condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine and applaud the Ukrainian people's courageous resistance. I applaud the courage shown by Russian dissenters at enormous cost to themselves. I say this while being acutely and painfully aware of the hypocrisy of the United States and Europe, which together have waged similar wars on other countries in the world. Together they have led the nuclear race and have stockpiled enough weapons to destroy our planet several times over. What an irony it is that the very fact that they possess these weapons now forces them to helplessly watch as a country they consider to be an ally is decimated. A country whose people and territory, whose very existence imperial powers have jeopardized with their war games and ceaseless quest for domination. And now I turn to India. I dedicate this talk to the increasing numbers of prisoners of conscience in India. I ask us to remember my friend, Professor G.N. Sai Baba, the scholars, activists, singers, and lawyers who are known as the Bhima Koregaon 16, the activists jailed for protesting against the Citizenship Amendment Act, the CAA, and Khurram Parvez, who was arrested 5 months ago in Kashmir. Khurram is one of the most remarkable people that I know. He and the organization he works for, the Jammu Kashmir Coalition of Civil Society, JKCCS, have for years meticulously documented the saga of torture, enforced disappearances, and death visited upon the people of Kashmir. So what I say today is dedicated to all of them. All dissent has been criminalized in India. Until recently, dissenters were called anti-national. Now we are openly labeled intellectual terrorists. The dreaded Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, under which people are being held for years without trial, has been amended to accommodate the current regime's obsession with intellectual terrorism. We have all been branded Maoists or jihadis. The colloquial term for Maoist is urban Naxals, and have had targets drawn on our backs, making us fair game for mobs or legal harassment. It's only been a few days since I left New Delhi. In these few days alone, the momentum of events unfolding there makes it clear that we have crossed some kind of threshold. We cannot return to the shores we once recognized as our own. In March 2022, the Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP, won an unprecedented second term to govern India's largest state, Uttar Pradesh. The UP elections are usually read as the semi-finals for the general elections expected in May 2024. The election campaign was marked by saffron-robed godmen openly calling for mass killing and a social and economic boycott of the Muslim community. While the BJP's victory in the elections appeared to be robust, on the ground the contest was closer than the number of seats they won suggest. The result seems to have generated in BJP workers and leaders a peculiar, untenable mix of anxiety and overconfidence. Very soon after the elections were announced, Hindus celebrated the festival of Ram Navami, which coincided with Ramzan this year. To mark Ram Navami, violent Hindu mobs armed with swords and staffs rampaged through as many as 11 cities. Led by Swamis and BJP activists, they entered Muslim settlements, dog whistling outside mosques, chanting obscene insults, openly calling for the rape and impregnation of Muslim women and the Narsinghar, genocide of Muslim men. Any response by Muslims has led to the bulldozing of their property by the government or burning by mobs. Those arrested, almost all Muslims, are accused of conspiracy and rioting and will likely spend years in jail. One of those charged was in jail on a different charge long before Ram Navami. Another, Wasim Sheikh, accused of pelting stones at a Hindu procession, is a double amputee and has no forearms. Their homes and offices were bulldozed by the government. In some cities, crazed TV anchors rode inside the bulldozers. Meanwhile, BJP leaders who openly provoked Hindu rioters in the run-up to the 2020 Delhi massacre were recently acquitted by the Delhi High Court, which held that there is no criminality when provocative things are said with a smile. Some of them are back on the streets in other cities, stoking similar violence. Yet the young Muslim scholar Umar Khalid is in prison. His speech about brotherhood, love and non-violence, upholding the Indian Constitution and delivered during the anti-CAA protests is, according to the police charge sheet, a smokescreen for a conspiracy that led to the 2020 Delhi massacre. Apparently, Muslims conspired to riot and kill themselves during Donald Trump's state visit in order to besmirch India's good name. Through all of this, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, whose own political career was jump-started by the 2002 anti-Muslim pogrom in Gujarat when he was chief minister, remains an inspirational figure. Often silent, but more often leading the dog whistling, he is the messiah of these mobs and their holy men who, fed on a steady drip of spurious history delivered by WhatsApp, portray themselves as victims of historic oppression and genocide perpetrated by Muslims, which must be avenged here and now. We are currently in that dangerous place where there is no set of facts or histories that we can agree upon or even argue with. The narratives do not overlap or even intersect with each other. It's myth versus history. The myth is backed by state machinery, corporate money, and countless 24/7 TV news channels. Its reach and power is unmatchable. The world has been there before, and we know by now that when debate and argument end, a war of attrition begins. Imagine what it must be like to be marked for death or incarceration. As a community, Muslims are already being ghettoized, ostracized, and socially and economically boycotted. Muslims are routinely accused of love jihad, which is conspiring to make Hindu women fall in love with them in order to increase the Muslim population. Corona jihad, conspiring to deliberately spread COVID, a replay of how the Nazis accused the Jews of deliberately spreading typhus. Job jihad, conspiring to get jobs in the civil service and rule over the Hindu population. To say nothing of food jihad, dress jihad, thought jihad, laughter jihad, Munawar Farooqi, a young Muslim comedian, spent months in jail for a joke he never made but was accused of planning to make. Any argument, any tiny misstep can get a Muslim lynched and the lynchers garlanded, rewarded, and assured of a bright political future. Even the most hard-bitten and cynical amongst us find ourselves whispering to each other, are they posturing or has it begun? Is it organized or out of control? Will it happen at scale? India as a country, as a modern nation state, exists only and solely as a social compact between a multitude of religions, languages, castes, ethnicities, and subnationalities, legally bound together by a constitution. Every Indian citizen belongs in one way or another to a minority. Our country is a social compact between minorities. In the process of trying to create a political majority, that social compact is being undone by an artificially constructed, aggrieved Hindu majority that is being tutored to believe that they are the only deserving citizens, the first people of a putative Hindu nation, a majority that defines itself against the anti-national other. India is being undone. Few of us who make up this nation of minorities can put forward a neat, unblemished history of ourselves in which we are blameless victims of aggression. Our histories intersect, interlock, and aggregate. Together they make us who we are. Other than the overarching hierarchy of caste, class, religion, gender, and ethnicity, our society is hierarchical at a molecular level. There is micro-colonialism, micro-exploitation, micro-interdependence. Every thread of this tapestry is an epic that calls for scholarship, study, argument, debate, reflection. But to isolate a single thread from this weave and use it to call for mass rape, for genocide, is that something to be countenanced? When the Indian subcontinent was partitioned and hundreds of independent princely kingdoms were assimilated, some of them forcibly, into either India or Pakistan, hundreds of thousands of people, Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh, turned on each other. 1 million people were killed, tens of millions displaced. Any single story of individual or community catastrophe and misfortune, however true it may be, is false when it is told in ways that erase the other stories. It's a dangerous lie. To flatten a messy history, to rob it of nuance, to weaponize it, will have dire consequences. All of us in the subcontinent have the choice of either working toward a shared notion of justice, toward exercising the pain, hate, and hate that gnaws away at our collective memory, or enhancing it. The Indian Prime Minister, the political party which he heads, and its mothership, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the RSS, the fascist organization of which he is a member, have chosen to enhance it. They are calling up something deeply wicked from the bowels of our blood-soaked earth. The fire they have lit will not burn along a designated path. It may well burn our country down. The blaze has begun. Alongside the Muslims of India and Kashmir, Christians too are on the front lines of their assault. In this last year alone, there have been hundreds of attacks on churches. Statues of Christ have been desecrated, priests and nuns physically assaulted. We're on our own. No help will come. It didn't come to Yemen, to Sri Lanka, to Rwanda. Why should we hope otherwise in India? In international politics, only profit, power, race, class, and geopolitics determine morality. Everything else is merely a posture, a shadow dance. India is ruled by men who have risen to power on the daylight mass murder of thousands of Muslims, on a series of false flag attacks and hysteria manufactured by phantom assassination plots. Certainly, there's opposition to this hatefulness from ordinary people of every caste and creed, from those who rose against the Anti-Muslim Citizenship Amendment Act, from the historic farmers' movement last year, and from regional political parties in West Bengal, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and Maharashtra that have gone toe-to-toe with the BJP and defeated it. It would be fair to say that the majority of Indians do not approve of what is happening, but their disapproval is manifested for the most part by distaste, by a karmic shrug, and a turning away that is entirely ineffectual before the burning ideological fervor of a well-paid fascist cadre. The Indian National Congress, the sole national opposition party, only offers us weakness and the inability to take a moral position, to even say the word Muslim in public speeches. Modi's rallying call for a Congress Mukt Bharat, an India free of the Congress party, is really a call for a government without an opposition. Whatever else we may wish to call this, democracy is not the word that comes to mind. While India exhibits all the trappings of an electoral democracy, a constitution that calls us a secular socialist republic, free and fair elections, a parliament run by a democratically elected ruling party and opposition, an independent judiciary, and a free media. In truth, this state machinery, including to a great extent and increasing extent the judiciary, the civil services, the security forces, the intelligence services, the police, and the election apparatus, is being, if not outright taken over, then deeply influenced and often overwhelmed by the most powerful organization in India, the overtly fascist Hindu nationalist RSS. The RSS, founded in 1925, has long campaigned to have the constitution set aside and for India to be declared a Hindu Rashtra, a Hindu nation. RSS ideologues have openly admired Hitler and equated the Muslims of India with the Jews of Germany. Aryan supremacy, the idea that some humans are divine and godlike, while others are subhuman, polluted, and untouchable, is after all the very basis of Brahminism, the Hindu caste system, which is and continues to be the organizing principle of Hindu society even today. Tragically, many, even the most oppressed, have rallied to the cause of the RSS, swept up by the tsunami of propaganda that has left them voting for their own subjugation. In 2025, the RSS will mark its 100th year. 100 years of evangelical dedication has made it a nation within a nation. Historically, the RSS has been tightly controlled by a coterie of West Coast Brahmins. Today, it has 15 million members, among them Modi, several of his cabinet ministers, chief ministers, and governors. It's a parallel universe now with tens of thousands of primary schools, its own farmer, worker, and student organizations, its own publishing wing, an evangelical wing that works among forest-dwelling tribes to purify them and return them to Hinduism, a range of women's organizations, a several million-strong armed militia inspired by Mussolini's black shirts, and a plethora of unimaginably violent Hindu nationalist organizations that perform the role of shell companies and provide what is known as plausible deniability. As India hemorrhages jobs and devolves into economic chaos, the BJP has grown steadily wealthier and is now the richest political party in the world, underwritten by a recently introduced system of anonymous electoral bonds that enable an opaque system of corporate funding. It is supported by several hundred corporate-funded TV news channels in virtually every Indian language that are mass-marketed by an army of social media trolls who specialize in disinformation. For all this, the BJP remains still merely the front office of the RSS. Now the nation within the nation is preparing to move out of the shadows and take its place on the world stage. Already, foreign diplomats have begun to troop to the RSS headquarters to submit their credentials and pay their respects. University campuses in the United States are the new battleground in this desperate quest for legitimacy. The danger is that those leading the charge believe that what cannot be fairly won can perhaps be purchased in an unfettered capitalist economy. The 2025 RSS centenary celebration will be an important marker in India's history. The year before that, we will have a general election. This perhaps explains the sudden acceleration of violent activity. Meanwhile, Modi the Messiah is omnipresent. His face is on our COVID vaccine certificates and on the bags of flour and salt delivered in lieu of jobs to the millions of newly unemployed. How can people not be grateful? How can they, who witnessed the mass cremations and shallow graves and saw the holy Ganges flow thick with bodies, its banks lined with shallow graves during the second wave of the pandemic, not believe what they are told to believe? That if it weren't for Modi, things would have been much worse. Our hopes have been cauterized, our imaginations infected. If the RSS wins this battle, its victory will be Pyrrhic because India will cease to exist. Elections will not reverse the tide. It's too late for that. This battle will have to be waged by every single one of us. The blaze is at our door. Thank you.
Arundhati, that was incredible. Sorry, howdy, Arundhati.
Namaste, Raj.
Goodness, has it begun? I mean, I'm pleased that you feel welcome here in Texas. This is...
I just said Austin.
Ah, fair enough. But this is the University of Texas, where we have a Liberty Institute, where the free market and its ideologues will be made generously welcome by state funding of certain kinds of knowledge. This is the city in which our children are taught that we live in one nation under God, and then they are taught to salute not just the flag of the United States, but the flag of Texas. This is, this is
I think the solution to that is produce a whole lot of more flags to salute. Dilute the problem.
But, I mean, you heard the land acknowledgement earlier on, though, right? I mean, the act of making our children say this is one nation under God is the kind of work that happens every day to make people forget that there are 500 other nations in this country that have been, that have had their land stolen. And that, the idea of God and nation trumping any kind of other sort of history is something that we were talking about it earlier on today, right? I mean, there's something that resonates very deeply in Indian history, in the ways that this story begins in the 1800s, not just in Texas, but in India as well. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about your meditations on how God and nation began in certain kinds of organizing and proselytizing under colonialism in the 1800s.
Well, yes, it's true. I think the aspiration of perhaps the sort of, BJP, RSS-led Indian upper caste Hindus is that someday, the rallying cry being Hindu, Hindi, Hindustan, one language, one religion, one nation. Never mind that all three are Persian words. That was just like somehow someone forgot. But actually it is interesting because I briefly mentioned the idea that one of the reasons that there is so much violence now is that what is being sought to be done is to create a political majority by using religion as a rallying cry. But in the mid-1800s, for example, at the time, it wasn't that people actually called themselves Hindu, because Hindu was really a name used for people who live east of the Indus. But people would identify themselves by their caste. You know, are you a Brahmin? Are you a Jat? Are you a Baniya? What is your caste? And it is a society, intricate hierarchy of caste. But as you know, the idea of riding into the capital and winning the throne by war receded, and the idea of representative politics began to appear, you began to need a constituency of large numbers. You needed to form a constituency, you know, so you needed subjects started to need to become citizens. And that is when you had a lot of anxiety in states like the Punjab, undivided Punjab, for example, where the Hindu population suddenly declined dramatically. And the reason for the decline was that millions of people seeking to escape the oppression of caste converted to Sikhism, converted to Islam, converted to Christianity. So when this demographic anxiety became a big issue, you had Hindu reformist organizations like the Arya Samaj, the Jat Pat Todak Mandal, who started to proselytize, trying to keep you know, the oppressed castes within the Hindu fold. I mean, to maintain the caste system, but to somehow not, somehow prevent them from converting to other religions. And so today you have a similar anxiety about numbers, about demography. And so one nation under God is what they are trying to create from what are clearly thousands of minorities, languages, ethnicities, castes, subnations, and that process of trying to create that political majority under the flag of religion is what is creating the violence right now.
The prospects of democracy under that feel very dim, and yet India was the host of the world's largest protest very recently, when farmers spent more than a year taking on Modi's work. I mean, his attempt to privatize certain kinds of markets and you know, begin a process of handing over the land to large corporations. Was there not in that moment a glimmer of hope here? Because the pushback wasn't constructed in terms of you know, of religion or of God, but of a betrayal of the peasantry, and that seemed to be a really important kind of recuperation of democracy in a place where, as you say, it is vanishing.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't use the word host, because the farmers' protest was not hosted by this government. The government did everything it possibly could to decimate it. But if you actually look back, I mean, I'll just take your question and take it back a little further. I keep thinking about the fact of, if you look at the history of protest in India, you know, about land, about wealth and revolutionary thinking. In the 1960s, you had revolutionary movements demanding the redistribution of land, the redistribution of wealth, the demand for land to the tiller. Now, these movements were brutally crushed. Most of them were obviously led by the left or extreme left. Then in the 80s and 90s, you had you know, the extraordinary anti-dam movements, anti-displacement movements. So from demanding the redistribution of land, you're pushed to asking not to be displaced from your own lands. You know, millions of people with the big infrastructure projects were being pushed off their lands. Those movements were crushed. Then you came to a situation where the markets in the 1990s, the Indian market, all the protection was removed and it was thrown open to international capital. And you had people asking, because there was such a concentration of wealth while people were being displaced, and so they came up the demand for the employment guarantee, Rural Employment Guarantee Act. So from not being displaced, you end up saying, can we have 3 months, be guaranteed 3 months labor at minimum wages, which works out to less than you would spend in Austin on a decent dinner. This was for a whole year. So you had the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. And then now you have people, obviously with the citizenship law, the very citizenship is under threat. In the face of this, even in the 2000s, I know you read my essay called Walking with the Comrades, where you had what was known as Operation Green Hunt during the Congress time. You had hundreds of thousands of paramilitary flooding the forests of central India because forest dwelling tribal land was being handed over to mega corporations. There were these vigilante armies, they were burning villages and so on. At that time, who was fighting corporatization? It was the poorest people in the land. They were being called terrorists. I mean, they did form themselves into a Maoist army where there were 50% of them were women and armed. But Maoist was a name. What they were really fighting was the takeover of their lands. But they were and have been successfully, called terrorists. There is the battle is still on, although the push for that land somehow has lessened because some of the corporates withdrew. Now that's so what the people, the indigenous people, as well as small farmers in the Narmada Valley were fighting in the 80s and 90s. The people in central India of Bastar, mostly forest-dwelling tribes, absolutely no middle class, no money, no cell phones, no presence on the social media, were fighting in the early 2000s. Now the water rose up to the nose of the very rich farmers of Punjab. And they rose up and really, it was one of the most extraordinary moments of India's history, that the farmers' movement, which hasn't ended, by the way, but it was because there were rich and middle class farmers who were able to sustain that movement for a whole year, who were able to stand up to the firepower, to the media power of the government, that enabled that movement to happen while dealing with its own contradictions, because there were big farmers, there were landless workers, there was all kinds of things going on in there, and is. But we don't have to give the government any credit for hosting it.
You are absolutely right. That was a poor choice of words there. But talking about choice of words, I mean, you are a writer, and one of the ways that you're, when I think about the sort of through line here, from thinking about Maoist politics and thinking about who it is that's doing the fighting, what the common denominator here is that there are people who are working class, who are poor, who are peasants, who are the poorest of the poor in India, who have rich intellectual lives and rich lives of their own that are rarely seen by the middle class. I mean, when I think about the Ministry of Utmost Happiness, one of the amazing sort of processes of coming to this fantastic series of characters is that these are all folk who are dancing on the edge of the boundaries that the state is trying to put down, and whom the state refuses to see, refuses to acknowledge are capable of intelligence or of engagement or of political volition in one way or another. And again, this gets us back to the story of the land, right? You've talked about how in the Ministry of Utmost Happiness that there is chatter between two graveyards. And I'm wondering if you might be able to read a little bit of your fiction for us this evening, thinking about some of the characters who, again, are invisibilized from the discourse of Indian politics and whose voices are now inhabiting you.
So the thing about the characters in the Ministry of Utmost Happiness is that they are not only people that the state wishes to either criminalize or invisibilize. They are people that society wishes. Society in India, you know, I keep saying this, that people, especially people who, I keep wondering, what do people who've never ever been to India feel when they go to India? Because it's such a, it's just such a world that's so hard for people to decipher. And I think the first thing that probably occurs to people is chaos, and they therefore naturally assume that the chaos of the streets and the chaos of everything that's going on there is because Indian society is chaotic, but it's not chaotic. It is the most ordered, hierarchical society that lives in the grid of caste, especially of caste. Rarely do people marry across caste or religion. Increasingly now it's becoming a problem. So in the Ministry of Utmost Happiness, what you have are a whole lot of, and I didn't plan it this way, just so happened that they eventually come to live together in a graveyard just outside the city of Old Delhi. And when you look at who lives in that graveyard, who dies in that graveyard, who says the prayers, it actually turns out to be a revolution, you know, because all the characters have sort of borders running through them, you know. So yeah, I mean, and of course the chatter between graveyards in the book and in the Clark lecture that I did in Cambridge about, which is called The Graveyard Talks Back, is about the fact that it's a conversation between Kashmir and India in some ways. And Kashmir is often described as Jannat, as paradise, and you have this paradise, this valley that is paradise, which is covered with graveyards from the struggle that has for self-determination in Kashmir. I think in the ministry I say that the gravestones grew out of the ground like young children's teeth. And then you have the graveyard in Old Delhi where Anjum, who is called in Urdu a hijra, who's like a transgender person who gets caught up in the massacre in Gujarat, and she actually escapes because she's a hijra, otherwise she would have been killed. But she cannot go back to her life as she knew it because of the trauma of what she saw there. So she moves out of her khwabgah, the house of dreams where she lives with others like herself, and moves into a graveyard where eventually she builds a guest house in which each room encloses a tomb. And so you have the paradise of Kashmir, the Jannat, covered with graveyards, and in Old Delhi you have a graveyard covered by the Jannat guest house, and there is a conversation between them which is proscribed because these conversations are not allowed in India right now, but I guess in fiction they don't know quite how to deal with it. But yeah, I mean, I'll read a small paragraph maybe for you. It's about Kashmir, but I have to warn you that this passage, it is written in first person because it's the voice of an Indian intelligence officer. So a person who has the best interests of the Indian state, but a very brilliant intelligence officer, but he has the best interests of the Indian state in mind, and he's doing the work of the Indian state, but he's a very sophisticated, perhaps you could call him a product of the Nehruvian time more than now, you know, a very upper caste, very intelligent, erudite, self-critical person. So it says, by Monday morning, the weekend body count had risen to 19. The 14 demonstrators killed in the firing, the boy the Ikhwanis had shot, Musa or Commander Gulrez or whatever the hell he wanted to call himself, and the 3 bodies of militants killed in a shootout in Ganderbal. Hundreds of thousands of mourners had gathered to carry those 19 coffins, which included an empty one for the boy whose body had been stolen, on their shoulders to the martyrs' graveyard. The governor's office called to say that it would not be advisable for us to attempt to return to the city until the following day. In the afternoon, my secretary called, "Sir, sun lijiye please. Listen, sir." Sitting on the veranda of the Dachigam Forest guest house, over bird song and the sounds of crickets, I heard the reverberating boom of 100,000 or more voices raised together calling for freedom. Azadi, 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 on and on and on. Even on the phone, it was unnerving. It was as though the city was breathing through a single pair of lungs, swelling like a throat with that urgent, keening cry. I had seen my share of demonstrations by then and heard more than my share of slogan shouting in other parts of the country. This was different, this Kashmiri chant. It was more than a political demand. It was an anthem, a prayer. The irony was, and is, that if you put 4 Kashmiris in a room and asked them to specify what exactly they meant by Azadi, what exactly are its ideological and geographic contours, they would probably end up slitting each other's throats. And yet, it would be a mistake to chalk this down to confusion. Their problem is not confusion, not really. It's more like a terrible clarity that exists outside the language of modern geopolitics. All the protagonists on all sides of the conflict, especially us, exploited this fault line mercilessly. It made for a perfect war, a war that can never be won or lost, a war without end.
Arundhati, we're transitioning, as I promised we would, into the part of the conversation where we have questions from the audience. And there's this particularly lovely one that I'm excited to share with you. And it runs like this. In light of the recent attack on students in JNU in Delhi, while many student protesters continue to remain incarcerated, what do you think students can do to dissent in such times? How can students continue to organize at home and abroad in order to resist as this transnational force of fascism looms large?
Well, you know, for those of you in the audience who don't know, one of the sites of continuous attack by this regime in India is universities. In particular, one of the best universities in India, which is JNU, Jamia Millia, Aligarh Muslim University, the Film Institute, you know, all these places where it's not that fascism is opposed to intellectuals. It's opposed to all forms of intelligence, you know, whether it is the intelligence of sowing the seed or tilling the ground or weaving something beautiful or creating art, or these spaces where students are debating and thinking, and especially a university like JNU, which actually the reason it has been crushed is that it was a university that allowed large numbers of students from rural areas, from oppressed backgrounds, people who would never normally get an education, to get a wonderful education, to then get into very senior positions in government, to have these very, very important debates about caste, about between left and between anti-caste groups, sometimes ferocious arguments, but necessary ones. And this government has shut it down. It has sent in goons. It has sent police into Jamia Millia Islamia in Delhi during the anti-CA protests, who attack students with weapons that you normally use for terrorists, that attacked the library, similarly in Aligarh, that arrested many people. So what can students do? The first thing I would say is that do not forget that that battle is here now to take over these spaces, because there is a great move to gain legitimacy, to gain respectability. So US campuses are being, there is a great move to try and take them over. And even in India, now they want to be published by respectable publishers who are being forced to publish these very mediocre, often plagiarized books, but all they want is the label, that this is a Penguin book or this is whatever. So what can students do? Students have been doing great work in India. They have stood up very bravely. They have been decimated. They have been beaten. Then they suffered COVID. Now they're coming back. Students will do what students have historically done, and they will be on the front lines, because let me tell you, this battle, no one is going down without a fight. That's not happening,
Many of these questions begin with thank you, and thank you for, it's important just for us to be grateful to have your voice in this space, and I do want to thank you for your courage, and in particular, a lot of people are observing that you are under attack yourself, and are wondering if you could talk a little bit about what it's like to be you right now.
Well, one of the things that I really hesitate to do is to place myself on the front lines of, I'm this great martyr and I'm under attack, because everyone is under attack, I'm under attack. The stakes are high both ways. I'm protected, and I'm also, because I'm so high profile, the dice is rolled and it's high. But the fact is that, like you were asking me today, because I said sometimes it's just so exhausting for us in India. You just wake up and feel like you have to remove this tower of weights on your chest every morning before you can even breathe, because every day someone is under attack. Whole communities, like I read, are under attack. People are being threatened with rape. People are having their properties broken down. So we can't here be like, oh, I'm so tragic, I'm under attack, I'm the only person. That conversation should not happen. And when Raj asked me, why don't you come away for a while or forever or whatever, I said, because I'm not a human being, I'm a tree. I have roots in there, and my leaves would fall if I had to leave, So we are, we look out for each other, we protect each other, we stand up for each other. So many of the names of the people who are in jail today, whose names I read out, all of them have eaten at my table. All of us are friends, but we cannot allow ourselves to be beaten down or to be frightened by this, because in truth, the people who are the biggest cowards in the world are these mobs who go around in their hundreds or 200s beating up single people. But they are cowards, they are shameless cowards. And this, they know deeply that they are cowards.
Arundhati, you've traveled widely, you've seen struggles, thank you, from around the world, from Palestine to Kashmir. I wonder if you might be able to tell us a little bit about what is actually happening on the ground in Kashmir. I know that you had some writing that you might be able to share with us on this if that feels appropriate. But I know that there's, we've been seeing propaganda about what is going on in Kashmir, and I'm wondering if you might be able to respond to that in a way that.
Yeah, well, I can. I mean, in this book, Azadi, there's a essay which was published in the New York Times called "The Silence is the Loudest Sound," which was published soon after Section 370, which constitutionally guarantees Kashmir special status, was struck down unilaterally in August 2019, following which for a whole year 7 million Kashmiris were subject to a communication and internet siege. Can you imagine what that means? I mean, forget about hospitals, surgeries, what you need the internet for every minute of the day. You can't even get an OTP, That was done to 7 million people. But now today, Kashmir, as we have often said, is the most dense, people are living under the densest military occupation in the world. And the Kashmiri press has been silenced. It is the valley from which no news must come, And now, after the abrogation of Section 370, that valley has been opened up to a flood of what is sought to be done is like what China has done to Tibet, or what Israel is doing, which is to create settlements to overwhelm the local population with this huge influx. That is what is being planned, and yet. By the army's own reckoning, they're just a handful of militants, but it's really the whole population that is considered insurgent, So it's being really held down. It has been robbed of oxygen. It has been robbed of free speech, and now it is going to be flooded with an overwhelming presence of not just the Indian population, but also business. It's going to be just culturally inundated. But I suppose what you are asking me is that recently there is a film that was made called the Kashmir Files, which sort of turned the whole history of what was going on there upside down and said that there was a Hindu genocide of Kashmiri Pandits by Muslims, and it is also what I was referring to, because there was a lot of violence against Kashmiri Hindus at the beginning of the insurrection, but there was much more violence, even by the militants, against Kashmiri Muslims. But I'll read you a little passage about what actually happened to Kashmiri Hindus from this essay of mine called "The Silence is the Loudest Sound." I say it would be foolhardy to summarize the twists and turns of how things have come to this. Let's just say that it's as complicated and as dangerous as the games the United States played with the puppet regimes in South Vietnam all through the 1950s and 60s. After a long history of electoral manipulation, the Watershed Moment came in 1987, when New Delhi flagrantly rigged the state elections. By 1989, the thus far mostly non-violent demand for self-determination grew into a full-throated freedom struggle. Hundreds of thousands of people poured onto the streets, only to be cut down in massacre after massacre. The Kashmir Valley soon thronged with militants, Kashmiri men from both sides of the border, as well as foreign fighters, trained and armed by Pakistan and embraced for the most part by the Kashmiri people. Once again, Kashmir was caught up in the political winds that were blowing across the subcontinent, and increasingly radicalized Islam from Pakistan and Afghanistan, quite foreign to Kashmiri culture, and the fanatical Hindu nationalism that was on the rise in India. The first casualty of the uprising was the age-old bond between Kashmir's Muslims and its tiny minority of Hindus, known locally as Pandits. When the violence began, according to the Kashmiri Pandit Sangharsh Samiti, or the KPSS, an organization run by Kashmiri Pandits, about 400 Pandits were targeted and murdered by militants. By the end of 1990, according to a government estimate, 25,000 Pandit families had left the valley. They lost their homes, their homeland, and everything they ever had. Over the years, thousands more left, almost the entire Pandit population. As the conflict continued, in addition to tens of thousands of Muslims, the KPSS says 650 Pandits have been killed. Since then, great numbers of Pandits have lived in miserable refugee camps in Jammu city. 30 years have gone by, yet successive governments in New Delhi have not tried to help them return home. They have preferred instead to keep them in limbo and stir their anger and understandable bitterness into a mephitic brew with which to fuel India's dangerous and extremely effective nationalistic narrative about Kashmir. In this version, a single aspect of an epic tragedy is cannily and noisily used to draw a curtain across the rest of the horror. Today, Kashmir is one of the most, or perhaps the most, densely militarized zone in the world. More than 500,000 soldiers have been deployed to counter what the army itself admits is now just a handful of terrorists. If there were any doubt earlier, it should be abundantly clear by now that their real enemy is the Kashmiri people. What India has done in Kashmir over the last 30 years is unforgivable. An estimated 70,000 people, civilians, militants, and the security forces have been killed in the conflict. Thousands have been disappeared, and tens of thousands have passed through the torture chambers that dot the valley like a network of small-scale Abu Ghraibs. Over the last few years, hundreds of teenagers have been blinded by the use of pellet-firing shotguns, the security establishment's new weapon of choice for crowd control. Yeah, it goes on.
Arundhati, we have about 10 minutes left. We started late, so I'm going to run. Apologies. We should have a bit more of Arundhati time, if you don't mind. And that means we've got time for a couple more questions. We are going to end with a question about hope, but we're not there yet. Because a lot of people want to know about caste, and a lot of people, including several supporters of the BJP who are here this evening, want to know, well, if things are so bad, and if all this bad stuff about caste is happening, how is it that the BJP wins? So I wonder if I can put that question at your door before we turn a corner.
Well, the question about caste is a complicated one, and if anybody likes, they can read a little book I've written called The Doctor and the Saint, and it explains a lot about caste. But even during partition and even now, this is what I was trying to explain to you earlier, that the way of trying to create a Hindu majority while retaining the caste system is the sort of complicated yoga move that's going on right now. And so you'll see that, in the early 80s and 90s, you had the rise of parties like the BSP, the Bahujan Samaj Party, led by Mayawati and Kashiram, which identified itself as a Dalit party in UP. And actually, she became chief minister several times because they came up with a remarkable coalition of Dalit groups and Brahmins. And then you had Lalu Prasad Yadav's party in Bihar, and then you had the Samajwadi party in UP this time, which put up an incredible fight. But the reason that the caste identified parties were decimated by the BJP is because the BJP understands caste very, very cannily, because it started to work with the small subcaste groups. Like if Mayawati's party was a Dalit party, it was predominantly a Jatav Dalit party, but there were several subcastes of Dalits below Jatavs in the hierarchy, which, you know, are upset by the domination of those immediately above them. Similarly, in what are known as OBCs, the other backward castes, there are, you know, dominant castes like the Yadavs, and then there are other OBC castes which resent that. So there was a complete mathematical change in how elections were fought and won. But the main thing about elections in India and what we call the first past the post system is that you can win what looks like a massive majority of seats with actually with a very small percentage of voters. Now, the BJP does have a large percentage of those who actually went out and voted, but if you actually do the math, it is still not the majority that it appears to be when you look at the number of seats in parliament. You know? So there's actually a big flaw in how the mathematics of this kind of first past the post electoral democracy works.
Well, that sounds very familiar. But if that's the case, and you know, again, this brings us back to where we started, where there are some very painful similarities between a government that's bought by corporations or a border that transmutes into this magical place of purity that then sweeps across the nation. What hope can you offer us?
Well, you know, I hesitate to be that person who just comes out and says, oh, you know, there's always hope and so on, because right now I am feeling that we do have to somehow negotiate something that could look very much like destruction before something is reformed, you know. But I'll say this, that, you know, before the elections in UP, I traveled pretty extensively in UP. I went to villages. I spoke to people across castes and communities. I spoke to even the Brahmin priests in various temples, some of whom were pretty furious with the politicization of religion. And what the farmers' movement did, other than force the government to pull back on the farm laws, was to put a new language out on the streets, you know, and that is extremely, extremely important. And I think that ultimately people, you see how elections are won and lost. Elections are an occult art. We know it, you know. And you have, when you have a lot of money, as the BJP does, more money than anyone else, it's like watching a Ferrari race a bicycle, you know. But bicycles can go down lanes which Ferraris cannot go down, you know. So you have so many things that were going on, you know, which you have here too, you know, sort of, you know, manipulating voter lists. And if you look at how close some of the seats were, you know, they were 500, 2,000 votes, you know, won by. So we don't have to lose hope in elections, but I think that the battle is beyond elections right now in India. I think the battle will be on the streets, the farmers' movements, the anti-CA movement. The minute there's a little breathing space, there's a massive outpouring of rage, you know, and that at some point will turn things around, I think, you know. But I mean, we don't have to just be thinking about India. I'm just thinking about India because when you're in a traumatized situation and traumatized place, you're just all the time trying to find a window or a pinhole of light. And I think, you know, what the world is going through, it's almost like a a convulsion or a kind of illness from which I know that we will recover, you know. I mean, sometimes when that huge tidal wave comes at you, all you can hope for is to just hunker down and hope that you're not swept away, but the wave will have to die because it cannot maintain this momentum forever, you know, it's just impossible. I think people are pretty horrified about what's happening in India right now. And while we cannot expect help from states and governments, because that is all expedient. Right now, there are many senators in India who will murmur about human rights of Kashmir or whatever, but that's only if India doesn't come down on their side on Ukraine. You know, these are just bargaining chips that people use, and India cannot take a moral position on Ukraine because 60% of its weapons and all the maintenance comes from Russia. Huge amounts of fuel come from Russia. So states are not moral entities, they are expedient entities that sometimes don moral garments. You know? But people can be moral, we can be moral, we can understand what's going on in each other's countries, in each other's campuses, and we can stand up for each other, you know.
That's something that, as you know, a new wave of food rebellions and protests around the world, you know, accompanying food price inflation, are already breaking. I mean, we're seeing Sri Lanka already, but you know, this is something that is incipient and is tragically, I mean, it's foreseeable, but that there are going to be these protests. And I desperately hope that the language of that protest becomes its own school for change. That we do learn these new vocabularies, these new ways.
I was watching some footage of a huge, like hundreds of thousands of people, farmers meeting in this place called Muzaffarnagar, where in 2013 a riot, a massacre was engineered between the Hindu Jat farmers and the Muslim farmers, and they both, after all those years, they had come together, you know, and it just really brought tears to my eyes because they said, we made a mistake, but we will not make this mistake again. And, you know, whenever someone says Allahu Akbar, the response will be Har Har Mahadev. And, you know, like we are together now. And so, you know, it'll take a while for people to understand, but I saw and heard for myself a language, even by people who were former BJP supporters, who said we voted for them enthusiastically, but they've just made fools of us. You know, so it will take a while, but it will happen.
Well, Arundhati, we've only scratched the surface of these questions, which were terrific. Thank you very much indeed for them. And obviously, I'll leave those for you to go through. But we've come to the end of our program, but I do need to make an announcement, which is that there are books for sale. And if you might be able to just line here, that would be terrific. But we haven't quite gotten to the end of the program because Arundhati is going to close us out with a reading. It is important that Arundhati have the last word, and she'll be reading from My Seditious Heart, which is available for sale right now. Line up here and exit that away after it has been signed. Arundhati, if you could take us out, that would be terrific.
Okay. So this is from an essay.
We haven't quite finished yet. Hang on.
This is from an essay called The Greater Common Good, about the struggle in the Narmada Valley against the big dams. And I just wanted to read it because it comes back to what you were saying about this auditorium being built on stolen land. So the last person I met in the valley was Bhaiji Bhai. He's a Tadvi Adivasi. Adivasi means original forest dweller from Undava, one of the first villages where the government began to acquire land for the canal and its 75,000 kilometer network. Bhaiji Bhai lost 17 of his 19 acres to the canal. It crashes through his land, 700 feet wide, including its walkways and steep sloping embankments, like a velodrome for giant bicyclists. I mean, this is a dam that displaced hundreds of thousands of people and destroyed an ancient river valley civilization. The canal network affects more than 200,000 families. People have lost wells and trees. People have had their houses separated from their farms by the canal, forcing them to walk 2 or 3 kilometers to the nearest bridge, and then 2 or 3 kilometers back along the other side. 23,000 families, let's say 100,000 people, will be, like Bhaiji Bhai, seriously affected. But they don't count as project affected and are not entitled to rehabilitation. Like his neighbors in Kevadia colony, Bhaiji Bhai became a pauper overnight. Bhaiji Bhai and his people forced to smile for photographs on government calendars. Bhaiji Bhai and his people denied the grace of rage. Bhaiji Bhai and his people squashed like bugs by this country they're supposed to call their own. It was late evening when I arrived at his house. We sat down on the floor and drank oversweet tea in the dying light. As he spoke, a memory stirred in me, a sense of déjà vu. I couldn't imagine why. I knew I hadn't met him before. And then I realized what it was. I didn't recognize him, but I remembered his story. I'd seen him in an old documentary film shot more than 10 years ago in the valley. He was frailer now, his beard softened with age. But his story hadn't aged. It was still young and full of passion. It broke my heart, the patience with which he told it. I could tell that he had told it over and over and over again, hoping, praying, that one day one of the strangers passing through Undava would turn out to be good luck or God. Bhaiji Bhai, when will you get angry? When will you stop waiting? When will you say, that's enough, and reach for your weapons, whatever they may be? When will you show us the whole of your resonant, terrifying, invincible strength? When will you break the faith? Will you break the faith, or will you let it break you? To slow a beast, you break its limbs. To slow a nation, you break its people. You rob them of volition. You demonstrate your absolute command over their destiny. You make it clear that ultimately it falls to you to decide who lives, who dies, who prospers, who doesn't. To exhibit your capability, you show off all that you can do and how easily you can do it. How easily you could press a button and annihilate the earth. How you can start a war or sue for peace. How you can snatch a river away from one and gift it to another. How you can green a desert or fell a forest and plant one somewhere else. You use caprice to fracture a people's faith in ancient things, earth, forest, water, air. Once that's done, what do they have left? Only you. They will turn to you because you're all they have. They will love you even while they despise you. They will trust you even though they know you well. They will vote for you even as you squeeze the very breath from their bodies. They will drink what you give them to drink. They'll breathe what you give them to breathe. They will live where you dump their belongings. They have to. What else can they do? There's no higher court of redress. You're their mother and their father. You're the judge and the jury. You're the world. You're God. Power is fortified not just by what it destroys, but also by what it creates. Not just by what it takes, but also by what it gives. And powerlessness reaffirmed not just by the helplessness of those who have lost, but also by the gratitude of those who have or think they have gained. This cold contemporary cast of power is couched between the lines of noble-sounding clauses in democratic-sounding constitutions. It's wielded by the elected representatives of an ostensibly free people. Yet, no monarch, no despot, no dictator in any other century in the history of human civilization has had access to weapons like these. Day by day, river by river, forest by forest, mountain by mountain, missile by missile, bomb by bomb, almost without our knowing it, we are being broken. Big dams are to a nation's development what nuclear bombs are to its military arsenal. They are both weapons of mass destruction. They are both weapons governments use to control their own people. Both 20th century emblems that mark a point in time when human intelligence has outstripped its own instinct for survival. They are both malignant indications of civilization turning upon itself. They represent the severing of the link, not just a link, the understanding between human beings and the planet they live on. They scramble the intelligence that connects eggs to hens, milk to cows, food to forests, waters to river, air to life, and the earth to human existence. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Arundhati Roy.
Thank you. Thank you.